It's go time.
Toronto Argonauts head coach Ryan Dinwiddie retrieves a toonie to start Grey Cup week.
Before the game. Okay, I've done this before. So I tape this in my locker before the game. Okay, I've done this before. All right, we're coming back.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I'm gonna tape it. I'm gonna leave it in there so I can come back and get my $2, and we're coming back. Right? Let's go start the work week in the proper way. Now I'm really gonna be light on you guys day one. But I'm proud of you guys. You guys fought, man. Thank you, man. I really respect you.
Welcome everyone to Quick Kicks on Third Down Gamble with Don Charbin and special guest Ben Grant of TSN 1050, color analyst on Argonauts radio broadcasts, and co-host of the X's and Argos podcast.
Well, welcome everyone. It's Don Charbin here with my very special guest from the Toronto Argonauts broadcasts on TSN 1050. It's Ben Grant, the game day analyst of football. Ben, great to have you on the program.
Really happy to be here.
Talk to me about your journey. What part of Canada are you from initially? Where did you grow up? All that sort of stuff.
It's been a long journey, so it's and the years are adding up too. I was born in Toronto, so I grew up mostly in Toronto, a little bit of a stint in France and England, but for the most part, I grew up in Toronto. And so this has been and still is my home. And I grew up as an Argos fan, as a Cincinnati Bengals fan as well. And these are all like side stories and tangents. I don't think we necessarily have to go down, but my Argos fandom, it started it was the perfect time because I was, 6, 7 years old, and a guy named Conridge Holloway came on the scene, and it couldn't have been better timing, because had I been growing up, at that age, maybe 5 or 6 years earlier, who knows, maybe I wouldn't have gone down that path. But Holloway and that team, that Grey Cup winning team, took over the city like nothing else. And I got swept up in that. And that was sort of where I fell in love with football and where I started paying attention to the Toronto Argonauts. So yeah, that was the beginning of this journey that now sits decades later. And with Argos things all over the place and my involvement with the Toronto Argonauts, it all began, I think, because of Conridge Holloway.
Well, that's great. Kudos to him. And of course, he was a dynamic quarterback when he played for the team. Got him to a Grey Cup in the early 80s. And Joe Barnes, unfortunately, led the team to victory in British Columbia.
And I was fine with that too. It was, just a team win. That's all we wanted. And it had been a while in Toronto, so that it was awesome. The timing was perfect, and that season had me for life. As soon as I got to see a couple of those games, and I was hooked.
As you go forward, now you're obviously a fan of the team. You've got to go through school. What got you trained up to get into the field that you're in now? How did those journeys sort of follow?
Yeah, there's a couple different sort of journeys and a bit of a strange path. So I played high school football like a lot of people did, but I had some really gifted athletes on my teams. We had Adriano Belli, the kissing bandit, on my high school team, Mike Abu-Metric as well, who had a CFL career, and you'll be familiar with him, of course. They were both on I think we all played on the same junior team together. We're separated a little bit by age. And so it wasn't this is Humberside Collegiate Institute. It wasn't a powerhouse football school by any means. And it was just strange. We had, I think there were 10 or 12 of us that ended up going to play at different universities. And so it was just this weird lightning in a bottle thing that happened to, coincide with my time there. I thought I was a much better player than I was. It wasn't until I got to university that I realized, this is not a career possibility for me on the field. I was suddenly, as the eighth string Z receiver, I was like, okay, this isn't going to work necessarily for me. And at York University, and if you're the eighth string at York University, then you know that there's a problem. So, but I wanted to stay involved in some way, and I didn't quite know how to do that. I suspected coaching would probably be a path I would follow. But I was open to the idea of broadcasting too. And I got really lucky because there was a guy named Herbie Kuhn who was doing all of the York University radio and stadium broadcasts and things like that. But he just got a job because there was going to be a new basketball team in town called the Toronto Raptors. And so they took him to be the stadium guy, and he trained me how to take over for him. Once my playing career was done, I took over for him doing some of the radio calls on CHRY and then some of the stadium announcing for a variety of different sports. And then after graduating, I decided, I like this sort of side of it. And I went to Humber College for radio broadcasting, thinking I'd probably pursue play-by-play or something of that nature. But I got a job in Top 40 instead. And so I worked in a couple of years in radio, bouncing around through a variety of chorus entertainment stations, from Magic 94.9 in Oshawa, and then to Mojo in Toronto, Edge 102, Q107, Energy FM. It was sort of all this conglomerate down at One Dundas in this tower of radio brilliance. But it only lasted a couple of years, and I kind of grew tired of it. And I just didn't see a path to moving forward in sports. And so my life path changed a few different times. I tried a lot of different things. I played poker professionally for a little bit. I dabbled in this and that. I tour guided. I was all over the place. Eventually decided teaching was the thing to do because it allowed me to go back to something I had originally thought of, which was coaching football. And so for the next, 17, 18 years, I ended up as a football coach, teaching high school, coaching football, and staying as involved as I could with the sport. And about 2018, mid 2018, a buddy of mine that I coached with, we sat down and decided, what's missing with the Toronto Argonauts is they don't really have a lot of analysis going on, a lot of media coverage. Why don't we start something up? And we started the X's and Argos podcast for the 2019 season, and just sort of grew from there. And how that turned into broadcasting opportunities, with now 20 years of coaching under my belt, having gone on to do some semi-pro coaching and a little small stint in the States as well. I had the experience to be able to do the color analysis, but I also had some radio experience, and the combination of those things made it a perfect fit. And so when the Argos and TSN reached out to be able to ask if I was interested in doing the color, I was like, yeah, for sure. And so, starting in the 2023 season, I was up in the booth full time with Mike Hogan and continued on to do that this year. And so that's my long journey into the Argos broadcast booth.
Awesome. It's not often that a game day analyst hasn't played in the CFL, but you kind of broke through that glass ceiling.
Yeah, it was a different path there. It's one of those things. I was thinking about that. I was thinking about it even with like Brent Monson, for example, who as the new defensive coordinator, although it hasn't been announced, I think by the team yet, but I think we know that's what's been done. Like, you look at his path to a defensive coordinator, he's a guy too that I don't think has any CFL experience, which is so rare to see for coaches. You just don't see it happen like that. But there are different paths to all of these jobs. And with broadcasting, you're right. Like, I don't think there's another color analyst in the league who doesn't have CFL playing experience. That's almost always a must. And I think what replaced that instead was the 20 years of coaching and the radio experience combined to be, that actually works out pretty well for what the job requirements are. Because I've spent 20 years breaking down film. I did play. Obviously not at the CFL level, but all of that stuff combined together, and to be able to articulate it a little bit helps a bit as well. I think too, what makes coaching good for the color analysis is that you break down film and you simplify it for players, especially newer players. And I think that's something that you get maybe especially coaching more so at the high school level than at the semi-pro level, where you're sometimes explaining things to players who really don't have any experience at all. And there's a degree of that on the radio where I see something and I don't want to just use football jargon to explain it. I want to make sure everybody understands what it is I saw.
Now, I believe you replaced Natea J, who had been in the booth, or am I wrong in that?
Yeah, it was Natea, and then Bob Bronk was doing it. He had come into the booth as well after Natea left. And then I did fill in for Bob Bronk for one game in the 2021 season. Is that right? 2022 season, sorry. And I guess that went well enough that I came back into the booth for 2023.
Now, your first, I believe, experience being the full-time guy, I think, was an exhibition game against the Hamilton Tiger Cats.
Well, if you don't count the substitute the year before where I filled in for Bob, then yes, it would have been a preseason game against the Ticats in Hamilton, I believe. Would have been the first time, yeah.
And what was that feeling like? Okay, let's forget that you've done it once before. Now this is your full-time job. What's the feeling like walking into that booth and going, "It's me now"?
It didn't really faze me at all. Like, I was happy to be there. I was really excited to have the position, and I still am. I think it's the greatest job in the world. But there was never a moment of being overwhelmed. I had done play-by-play before, and I had been in the press box for since 2019, I guess. And so the pregame routine for me hadn't really changed too much. I prepped the same way because we always did a post-game reaction podcast and a pregame walkthrough podcast leading up to the week. So the research was all the same. I was already attending practices. I was already talking to players and coaches. And so none of that really changed. And as my wife would tell you, I talk nonstop during the game anyway, to anyone that will listen about what I see, and annoy both her and my kids. And so it was just the same thing. It's just now I have a headset and a microphone, and people have to listen to me. So I guess that was the only difference. So it didn't really overwhelm me, and yet at the same time, I thought it was the greatest thing I'd ever been a part of.
And how long did it take for you and Mike Hogan to get your feel together? When to cut in and etc.
Not long, actually. That seemed to happen right away, and I think maybe that's because I had done play-by-play before. I'd been on the other side of it, so I had a sense of when he finishes talking, I know this is now my time, and we kind of will look at each other. We do communicate quite a bit through hand signals and just kind of looks to sort of say, yeah, this is my time, or I don't have anything here, or whatever it is. But we've never really had too much trouble in terms of cutting each other off or anything like that. We just seem to get into a rhythm right away where he describes what happens. As soon as I feel that he's done, I'll jump in with what I saw. And then as soon as they're getting ready to line up for the next play, I'll just stop talking and hand it back over to him.
And how much of a change in your day-to-day life has this been? Because I'm not totally sure. Do you have to do any hits for the radio station ahead of game time or during the week? Are you at practices? Are you expected to be there?
Yeah, and it does. It depends on the week, and I don't have a scheduled time, but I will go on a bunch of the TSN 1050 shows, and of course there are requests from other radio stations around the country as well, and so I will do those hits and make it work with my schedule. The nice thing about teaching is that my summers are freed up for this, and that's when the heart of the CFL season is, through sort of the end of the spring into the summer, and so I'm able to go to practices pretty much nonstop whenever I can make it, and I'm available for as much media engagement as is needed. And so that part seemed to work really well with the schedule that I had going on.
So when you're on the road with the team, especially if you're coming out west, what does that do to teaching? Because school is let's say in September. What do you have to do? Take holiday time? How does that work out?
Well, I've been very fortunate in that we haven't traveled a lot on the road. We've gone to a few games and it's worked out schedule-wise where it's fallen on a Saturday or what have you. But for the most part, we will actually record from Toronto, from the TSN studios in Toronto. We use the studio that they have there for the afternoon show. And so we've got monitors in front of us and monitors all around us, and we're just sitting across from a desk from each other. And it's not quite the same as being there in person. Certainly when you're there in the stadium, it's easier for me to see coverages than it is when I'm watching on monitors, but it just shifts the focus of what it is I'm analyzing. So instead of talking about coverages, I'll talk more about blitz packages and the protection up front and look more at the line play than I will at what the DBs are doing. So that actually, while I think some people might look on that as, well, it's too bad you're not able to travel to all the games, is actually that opportunity is what has allowed me to be able to do this, because I don't know what the answer would be. I don't know what I would do if I were going to every game on the road. I don't know if that would work out with my workplace. I'm sure we could come to some arrangement. I know we have had color analysts in the past who have worked as teachers, so there is a way to do it, but I've never had to actually look into that. I haven't had to miss a single day of work for any of the broadcasts.
That's fascinating. That's beautiful that the scheduling works out for you. I know from personal experience, it is vastly different when you have to call a game or look at a game through a monitor than being live in the stadium, because you just don't have the extra ambiance, the crowd noise, etc.
And I think that's harder for the play-by-play guy than it is for color. And that's where, like, Hoagie is such a pro. Like, Mike Hogan's been doing this forever. And, I think after the guys in Calgary, I think he's next up in terms of seniority and the number of years that he's put in. But yeah, he's just awesome. And from the beginning, he was so good at bringing me along too. And I never felt like, he just made sure that I felt comfortable and that I never felt like I was lost in any way. And he's taken care of me in every way that he possibly could to make sure that transition doing the color analysis was smooth. So I give him full credit for that and for being able to adapt to calling the games on the TV screen. He does a great job of it. You wouldn't know that we're not there. And that's saying something, because I think play-by-play is really tough in football, especially when you're not there.
Well, especially if the field of view is cut way down.
Yeah, I know exactly that. But again, he's a pro, and we found a way to do it. And, we will go to a lot of the local road games, and we were in Montreal, obviously, for the East Final as well. And so if it's possible, we'll be there for it. But if not, we can at least know that we can do the broadcast through the TSN studios.
Let's look at this season that brought the Argonauts the Grey Cup. When you started the season, Chad Kelly's on the shelf because of stuff that happened in the previous year. The Argonauts are looking with Cameron Dukes to get them through those 9 games and get above 500. What was the mood around the team? You're closest to it. Was there optimism? Was there fear?
There wasn't fear. I think there was a lot of optimism. From an outside perspective, I was kind of thinking they need to go 5-4 in these 9 games. If they can go 5-4, tread water, they'll be in a position where they can make a run when Chad Kelly returns to the team. I think they were more optimistic than that. I think they went into the season with a lot of confidence in Cam Dukes and their defense. Like, it's they just won the Grey Cup without Chad Kelly. Like, obviously this is a team with a lot of talent, and they really felt that. Like, from the beginning, there wasn't any different mood than there was the year before when they went 16-2. They were really confident in their abilities. They knew they had a good defense. They knew they had a great defensive line, and they knew they had the offensive line to be able to protect Dukes and bring him in gently where they didn't necessarily need to drop back and sling it 50 times a game. And so, yeah, I think there was a lot of confidence. I think they were almost disappointed with the 5-4 result after 9 games, whereas I kind of felt like that was a success.
Well, the Argonauts, and especially the East, seemed to dominate the West, and that must have helped as well, because if you're picking games off from the West, then games within the division may not hurt as much if you lose them.
Yeah, they had a really good record against the West. And what ended up being, like, the end of the season, it wasn't just the West. They were really good against good teams. It was the poor teams, the non-playoff teams, that really caused problems. They went 0-3 against Hamilton. They split against Edmonton. These teams that weren't making the playoffs, split against Calgary as well. And yet the teams that made the playoffs, they were very good against. They ended up going 3-0 against the Blue Bombers when all was said and done. 3-1 against the Alouettes, I think, including the playoff game. I think that spoke to the sort of competitive drive they had. 2-0 against the Lions as well, if you want to throw that in there. But yeah, it was something about when the level of competition was elevated, those guys answered the bell, and it didn't matter who was there at quarterback. Like, you look at those wins over the Blue Bombers, who I do consider to have been, if it wasn't them, it was the Alouettes. Like, those were the teams to chase at the end of the season. They beat the Blue Bombers with a variety of quarterbacks. There was 2 Nick Arbuckles and 1 Chad Kelly in those. Let's not forget they gave Winnipeg a run last year with Cam Dukes. It just didn't seem to matter who's at quarterback. And that's where you have to give Ryan Dinwiddie a ton of credit, where he not only gets his guys to play at that high level, it doesn't seem to matter who's on the field. He can find a way to get it done. And you're talking about the most important position in professional sports in the quarterback. And Dinwiddie seems to be able to get just about any professional quarterback in there and find a way to win a game, or at least be in it.
Well, he's sort of a quarterback whisperer. When you think about what happened this year.
I'm Derek Taylor, the voice of the Bombers on 680 CJOB, and I listen to the Third Down Gamble podcast.
They get to that East Final after a couple of wild games against the Ottawa Red Blacks, and Kelly gets hurt in the third quarter. What is the mindset then?
And I think the good thing for the Argos, and actually in some ways that might have been, it sounds wrong to say, like a blessing in disguise, but I think the reason why, I think they're a better team with Chad Kelly. I don't think there's any question about that. But I do think that injury helped them in some ways because the narrative all week long changed. Toronto was a huge underdog coming into that. With Chad Kelly healthy, I don't know what the line would have been. It would have been pretty close to a pick 'em, I'm imagining. I think the Blue Bombers might have actually been able to take the position of nobody believes we're going to get this done. We started 0-4 or whatever it was, and here we are. And instead, they were having to answer questions all week about things like, do you feel like last week was the real Grey Cup in the East Final, given that you're now 10-point favorites in the Grey Cup? And no matter how, and that coaching staff in Winnipeg, you know how professional they are. You know that team, they're not listening to the noise. And yet, just as a human being, you can't help but start to think about things like that. You know you're huge favorites. You're not having to go up against the reigning MOP. Things seem to have broken their way. And I think that really helped motivate the Argos. And the other side of that is they've had that experience before. They had Nick Arbuckle, Cam Dukes for the first half of the season. They know what that's like. And then tying this back to Ryan Dinwiddie, don't forget that this has been his whole career. Like when he first got to Toronto, 2021, his first season as a head coach, Nick Arbuckle was supposed to be the guy. That only lasted for a few games. Then McLeod Bethel-Thompson took over. And then McLeod was supposed to be the guy. And then he got hurt in the Grey Cup. And Chad Kelly came in. And then he's the guy. And then he got suspended. And it's Cam Dukes. And so he's had every manner of quarterback found a way to get it done. So that experience leading up to this is probably what made that work so well for the Argos. They were probably the only team in the league that could have afforded to lose their quarterback and been okay because of all the experiences they'd had leading up to that.
You mentioned something interesting about the noise, and with the Argonauts 10.5-point underdogs at the week start, and then probably moving down to 8.5, it reminds me of 2022 when they weren't that much different in terms of how much of an underdog they were, and yet look what they did in that fourth quarter of that game. It seems like the fourth quarter is so massive to these games against the Blue Bombers and Grey Cups.
And that's sort of a Toronto signature this year, especially, but the last few years, they've had some games that are tight at the half, and then they just roll away. And often it's the defense or special teams that come to life. Last year, Javon Leake seemed to find ways to score touchdowns at the right moment, went to McManus with pick sixes. And this year, that continued on with guys like Benji Franklin, who just caught fire in the playoffs. And it seemed like every pass that went his way was coming back for six the other direction. So, yeah, they have had these great second halves where they tread water in the first half, sort of keep their head above, and then really turn it on either offensively, defensively, special teams, or sometimes all three.
Kevin Iben and Howard Fields shared defensive coordinatorship. How did that go? It obviously worked in the Grey Cup, but through the year, how did they sort of juggle these responsibilities?
They didn't change their routine too much. I think that's something that worked really well. Like from when Corey Mace was the defensive coordinator last season, they kept the same style in that you had Iben on the sidelines and you had Fields up in the booth, and they sort of communicated the same way that they would have. The way I think Mace was calling the defense, it was kind of a collaborative process. They had that experience to lean on. I don't personally like that strategy, but you can't say it didn't work. They won the Grey Cup on the strength of their defense, I think. So you have to tip your hat to the innovation from Toronto's front office to say, hey, let's go without a defensive coordinator. Like, what a bold move in a season where you're already dealing with so many moving parts to be like, yeah, let's try something that no one does. The reason I don't like it is I always feel like you need to have a face. It's the same reason I don't like having platooning quarterbacks. I think the team kind of needs to look at someone as like, yeah, that's my leader. And the defense has a guy where it's like, that's my leader. Offense has their leader and so on. But I think I'm wrong because they found a way to make it work. And so I think the lesson I learned from that is you have to put an asterisk next to my rule and say, unless you've got a situation where the guys are completely comfortable with each other, there's no ego issue. And you didn't see that with them. Like Fields and Iben got along so well. They saw the game the same way and never let it get into this contest where it's all about one guy or the other, where the team was looking back and forth from one to the other saying, who am I listening to? They somehow avoided that. And I don't really know how, but they found a way to make it work. You
touched on the defense and how strong it was. And when you look at that front four, they seemed to catch fire in the back half of the season with, I believe it was 6 sacks in Winnipeg the previous time they'd met them. I'm sure they had put some fear into Zach Collaros' eyes.
I'm sure they did. It was such a good positional group. I think the strongest positional group of any in the league from any position. That D line for Toronto was stacked. You look at the sacks they were generating from the middle is what made it, because you had like Serezna was playing inside almost the entire season. We know he could go outside as well from his time in Edmonton, where we saw him do a little bit of both, but he was primarily a tackle this year. He was tied for the league in sacks. Then you had Ralph Hawley, this newcomer who's now getting a tryout with the Tennessee Titans and is making big news down there. For his inexperience, came out of nowhere. He was like plan C or D in the preseason because it was supposed to be Jared Brinkman. He was the guy, and I haven't even got to Brink yet. And he's by far the best run stopper. He can generate a pass rush too. And so we were going to the season thinking it's Serezna and Brinkman. He got hurt pretty early on, and Jordan Williams came in to play. And then Jordan Williams got hurt, and Jordan Williams is a great player too. He got hurt, and that's the only reason Ralph Hawley got on the field. And yeah, he was a menace. He found a way for a prototypical run stopper to get that much pressure on the quarterback was really eye-opening. And so you've got that mess in the middle of Brinkman and Hawley and Serezna that no guards and centers want to deal with. And then you've got guys that can fly on the outside like Flo Remalade, who you have to look out for because he's got that speed move and can just blaze past guys. So it made it very, very tough to block those front four. Robbie Smith on the other side I can't leave him out, obviously. Grey Cup hero Robbie Smith from a couple of years ago, a great pass rusher in his own right. And you look at those guys, whatever lineup you put out there, and you can put 5 out there if you want. They've got the speed and the athleticism to be able to twist and stunt and do whatever you want. It makes it really hard for the opposition to block them. So yeah, it wasn't a surprise to see them come to life against a team like Winnipeg.
Folarin Orimolade, the one thing that always impressed me about his style of play is that his motor kept running right through the fourth quarter. Where other guys were kind of tiring out, he was still going.
And I think it's because of his lightweight. Like, he's not your usual size. The first time I saw him when he was in training camp last year, and I went down to Guelph the first day of training camp, get some photos and talk to a few of the guys. And I remember looking over from a distance across the field at this positional group. I'm like, what is that linebacker doing with the defensive lineman? Because he's just a different build. And I was like, oh, that's a Remalade. Like, he is much smaller than I thought. And yet it doesn't seem to matter. I think the CFL is perfect for him because he obviously doesn't have the size to play that same position in the NFL, but he uses his stature as an asset in the CFL. You got so many of these hulking tackles with that great wingspan and those giant bodies out there, guys, 6'6", 6'7", and he's so low to the ground and he can get horizontal in his pass rush. It makes it really tough for those big guys to get those little guys coming around the edge. And he's so solid and he's so fast. And they play around with him too. He'll sometimes line up in a traditional middle linebacker spot and then join in somewhere along the line as a pass rusher. So they've found a way to really use him well. But yeah, he's been a force for sure.
And Wynton McManus, who I felt should have been the MOP of the Grey Cup. What a game he had, but what a playoff he had. He is just a stud back there.
Yeah, he is the best. He's the best linebacker in the league, I think. And there's so many good CFL linebackers, so that's saying something. I really do believe that. I felt that last year. I feel that this season. His energy, I think the way that he brings a team to life too, that's sort of new for him this year. Like, he wasn't as vocal a leader last season, just as good a player, but he didn't take on the leadership role because there were other leaders on the team. You had a Darius Pickett and you had AJ Ouellette sort of firing everybody up on the offensive side of the ball. He didn't need to be that guy because they had those guys. But this year, with the loss of some of those vocal leaders, they still had great leadership with their play, but they were missing those voices. And so he really had to step into that role, and it worked for him. I don't think everyone can make that transition, but he did it. And you hear him on some of those like CFL Wired shows where you hear it's just nonstop, and it's out there. He's getting his guys going, even when he was injured, to travel with the team like he was and be on the sideline and be there for support and as a teacher and everything else. Yeah, he's such a tremendous player. And I think you're right. He probably should have been the Grey Cup MVP, but I think everyone loves the story. And Nick Arbuckle, who was 30 days from being out of football as the Grey Cup MVP, I think was too good to pass up for the voters.
How much of an effort was it for Arbuckle to get prepped for that game? Because, I mean, that's a lot of responsibility.
It was the best thing, though, because there was no time, and that couldn't have been better for him because I feel like Arbuckle sometimes has been a bit of an overthinker throughout his career. You look at when he's been good, it's been coming in relief. Look back to his introduction in Calgary with Bo Levi Mitchell goes down. Suddenly, Arbuckle, you're in, and he was great. And, didn't have time to think about it. Came to Toronto, and he was supposed to be the face, the guy, everyone's looking to him, and he struggled. It wasn't the same. And everywhere he went after that, everyone was looking to him as, well, you're supposed to be this next great thing. And that wasn't really the right way for him to approach it. I think he did overthink, and one of those guys that work too hard sounds strange because I don't think that's necessarily a thing, but overthink maybe, over prepare to a point where you're seeing things that aren't necessarily there. And I think that he was a victim of that in some of his stops along the way, including his first stint in Toronto. When Kelly went down in Montreal, he didn't have time to over-prepare, and in setting up for the Grey Cup, there was no time for that either. With all the media obligations and everything else, it really should be a 2-week schedule in terms of all the demands that are placed on the players and coaches. I love that it's not. But in terms of everything that's expected of both Grey Cup teams, it really should be. But that worked out well for Arbuckle. Never had a minute to think about, man, here I am starting the Grey Cup. It was just, what plays are we getting down? I don't think Ryan Dinwiddie slept all week going into that game because he had that extra pressure on him to prepare a totally different guy. It's not like they had a Nick Arbuckle Grey Cup game plan locked away that they were just waiting to open. That was, from scratch, probably on the flight home from Montreal.
And what a ridiculous stat. The Argonauts have won 8 straight Grey Cups and 8 straight over the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in Grey Cups.
They don't lose Grey Cups, and they especially don't lose them against the Blue Bombers. I have no idea how you put a stat like that together. It doesn't make any sense. Because it's not like the same players. We're talking about decades of time. And that Winnipeg stat goes back to like the 40s. Yeah, one of those weird things. I don't know why. I can't explain it, but yeah, I'll take it.
Going into free agency in the offseason, obviously Wynton McManus is priority one. Coach has said that he wants Arbuckle back. Who else do you see as a key component that the Argos have to bring back so they can make another run in 2025?
I think that D-line, you've got a lot of free agents coming up along that D-line. You want to be able to retain as many of them as they can because it allowed you to do different things. When you've got pressure from that front four, it means you can make mistakes in the secondary and not necessarily have them cost you, especially early in the season. There were some busts that quarterbacks never got to see. We'd see them from up in the booth. Quarterback never saw it until they got to the sideline with their iPad because they don't have time. There's a guy breathing down their neck right in their face. And so if they can keep that defensive line, most of the offense is back under contract. Like, there's not going to be a lot of movement there. I think Isaiah Cage is the only guy that isn't along the offensive line, and almost all the skill position players are returning. You would love to see them bring back everybody, but it's really tough to do, especially after winning a Grey Cup. Everyone's price goes up a little bit. So if there is going to be an area of focus, you're right. Like, Wynton McManus has to be number one. You can't replace him. The Argos have done a really good job of replacing other guys that looked irreplaceable. I'm not sure Wynton McManus can be replaced. So he's the guy you try and keep, and then as many of those defensive line components as you can. You need Jared Brinkman in there because he's just such a difference maker, sort of one man does it all. And hopefully they can keep a lot of those guys under contract.
Ben Grant, thank you so much. Of course, people can find you and follow you on TSN 1050, but whereabouts on the socials can you be found?
So if you want to find me on Twitter or X, it's Ben_Grant. And I've also started on Blue Sky. I'm just sort of dipping my toes into that. So if you want to try and find me on Blue Sky, Coach Ben Grant, you can find me there as well. I'm not posting as regularly. I'm still trying to figure that platform out, but I know a lot of the CFL family went there, and so I want to make myself available wherever there are CFL fans.
Awesome. Thank you so much for doing this.
Love doing it. Love talking football with you. Thanks so much.
Third Down Gamble uses the expert resources of the Canadian Football League and 3 Down Nation. For up-to-date, insightful statistics and analysis, please visit cfl.ca and 3downnation.com. The CFL on CBC theme music is used with written permission from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
Thank you for listening to our show. Third Down Gamble is hosted on Podbean. Follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ThirdDownGamble. Join us again next time. The Third Down Gamble Podcast. Audio worth watching.